Hey everyone, I'm Anna Balkrishna. Thanks for having me. Today I'm going to be talking to you all about how to make organizational impact at your companies. A little bit about me. I've done a lot of different jobs in my career over the years. Editorial, digital publishing, a weird stint in TV, marketing, brand strategy, and of course, UX design. A lot of times these roles were pretty new in the world by the time I got to the company. I've been managing teams and people for about 15 years. I currently serve as the head of content design at Robinhood. I support an awesome team of 17 content designers and managers. So along the way, I've learned a little bit about building new things out of not much, which I'm going to share with you today. So work the org. As leaders, this can be the final stage in our growth path. If you're here, you are probably already a great content designer. You're probably also great at supporting people and inspiring your teams as well. But as you rise as a leader, you're going to find that more and more your success depends on your ability to work the org, to navigate the practical complexities of a business. Don't get me wrong, you need the high bar for craft, for strategy, for people to be an effective leader. But 90% of the time, I find that the challenges that content design teams face are deeply organizational. By that I mean our challenges are really tied up in the company where we sit, how it's structured, incentivized, and operates. Resourcing, scoping, collaboration, these are all really complex issues, and they can't be fully addressed just by urging individuals to work differently or set boundaries or educate people on what we do. Let's be real. Content design is not always super well understood at our organizations, very rarely by the C-suite. It might be a newer team, it might be a smaller team, it might be the first team the company's ever had. So our values and needs might not immediately resonate with top decision makers, at least not right away. So our ability to influence at an organizational level can sometimes feel like an uphill battle, but it is essential for us as leaders to set our teams up for success. So how do you do this when you're just one human or one group of humans and content design might feel like a bit of an underdog at your company? Today, I'm going to talk through 3 practical principles for leading content design within a complex organization. By practical, I mean these are some tactics that have consistently worked for me to get shit done for my team. So I'll ground these in some challenges that probably feel pretty familiar to us as content designers. Pain 1, no one cares about the thing I want to build. Maybe you want to hire, maybe you want to invest in new tools, but it's just not a priority for your company. Maybe on the list of priorities, content design comes below product or engineering or even other design functions. So that brings me to my first practical principle. Make it easy to say yes. I also like to call this one the win-win principle. This one is all about identifying what motivates other people in your org. You can get what you want by helping them get what they want. This one's practical to the point of being scrappy. It's definitely served me well over the years when I've needed backing to stand up new initiatives. I built the first UX writing team at the digital agency Huge back in 2018. After years of advocating to anyone who'd listen. I didn't succeed because our CEO finally heard me. I succeeded because I found other leaders who needed help and were willing to help me in exchange. The fact is, we operate in resource-constrained companies. Status quo is often good enough to just keep the wheels on the bus and keep the company running, unless we make it very easy for the org to change. So how do you do this practically? First step, find your allies. who is doing something that overlaps with what you want to do. Here's a hint, they might be underdogs too. Step 2, find out what motivates them. This might be funding, it might be staffing, it might be just proving the success of their own projects. Step 3, prove it out. You need to demonstrate to your allies how their interests align with yours. I like to also call this the pilot or the incubation phase. Pro tip, you'll probably have to play a long game here, like months or maybe years. So here's an example from my current role at Robinhood. When I came aboard a couple years ago, the content design team had grown from a tiny group of generalists who wrote every word at the company to a pretty largish group of UX practitioners. Unfortunately, their scope had not evolved with the company's growth. So I heard a lot of complaints from content designers about their workload, especially about writing help center content. One, help center articles were time consuming and they pulled them away from the UX work that they had been hired for. 2, many content designers just don't have the skills to write long form articles very well anyway. So the solution to me seemed obvious. The company needed a new content team dedicated to the help center. This would free up content designers to do the UX work they did best, and it would improve the quality of the help center because it would be owned by people who did that best. That seems simple, except fixing this problem was on nobody else's mind. There wasn't even a problem on anyone else's mind. As far as the company was concerned, the help center was getting updated on time, everything was fine. There was no clear incentive to change the way things operated. So I asked myself, how could I get to yes? First question, who would also benefit from hiring help center writers? So I learned about another new writing team at Robinhood. It's called Knowledge Management. The team had been formed to support customer support agents in answering customers' questions. This sounded a lot like the team I wanted to build. But I knew Knowledge Management also had a big workload and they had a limited budget. They were fellow underdogs. So I couldn't just roll up and demand that that team take Help Center off of Content Design's plate. They did not care about my problem yet at all. So I asked the next question. How could I make it very easy for Knowledge Management to take over Help Center? I know I didn't want to manage a Help Center team. This is not my wheelhouse either, but making it easy for others would require some extra investment from me up front. My expectation is that that would pay off eventually. So here's what I did. I found enough budget savings from nooks and crannies in the design org. Money we hadn't spent on vendors, money we hadn't spent on swag, money we hadn't spent on travel. I pulled that together. I was able to find enough money to pay the contracts of 2 freelance writers for a year. So I hired them, and at first I managed them myself. Second, I incubated the new Help Center team for 6 months under content design. So this made a lot of sense. Content designers had been doing the work. They were the closest to it and could train the new team. I managed them myself. I also helped them set up some processes that hadn't been there before. A clear intake process, a project tracking system. So that way product teams always knew how and when to engage with the new team. This had the extra benefit of redirecting product teams from content designers, which lightened their workload immediately. So that was a win-win. At the same time, I spent a lot of time building goodwill between the teams. So this was in the form of informal meetings. I led writing workshops with both teams to train them on how to write great support content. I basically just facilitated the teams coming together and getting to know each other and sharing information. Before long, they were meeting once a week informally just to share their notes on customers' biggest problems. Another win-win. So at the end of the day, it came down again to the money. The final piece to saying yes was removing the financial burden. At the end of the 6-month pilot, knowledge management was totally convinced of the new team's value. They were super excited to add 2 experienced writers to grow their team, but they didn't have any headcount either. So how was I going to help them say yes? I got my VP on board to transfer this contractor budget we'd found and give it to knowledge management for the rest of the year. We understood the long-term value of transitioning that team over there, and we knew that we would get our contract budget renewed the next year, so we just figured we could live without it for 6 months to help another team succeed. At this point, there was no reason to say no. We built the team for them. We demonstrated how the team could improve their own work. We gave them a long runway to pay for the new heads. So after this year, I expect the Help Center team to keep growing under their new management. It's just contributing so much value. Now they know they can't live without it. So it was a short-term financial hit for my org, but long-term set up content designers to focus on the right work, including myself. Okay, so that first principle works great as a carrot, but what happens when you need a stick? This brings me to another common challenge that we might face. Content designers are spread too thin, but I can't get any more headcount. As content design leaders, we're often asked to support efforts that our teams aren't really staffed for. I think this sometimes happens because people don't understand how content design works or what really goes into making something great. So when we're asked to support new initiatives, it can just be easy to try to keep our partners happy, which usually means peanut buttering our people and doing half-baked work. So this brings me to principle number 2, starve for success. This is another one that I've grown to rely on. This is the tough love principle. At root, it means being willing to let certain parts of the business struggle in the short term in order to set yourself up for success in the long term. So some people might just call this saying no or setting boundaries. Say no. That was a popular mantra for the content design team when I worked at Meta. It certainly helped content designers from burnout. But I found that organizations can interpret just say no as defensive. It might give content design a reputation for being a bottleneck or being uncollaborative, especially if our partners don't fully understand the trade-offs of saying yes. I found the concept of starving a little more compelling. This principle is really the opposite of make it easy to say yes. In this case, you might say, make it hard to do without. So I'm going to give you another example. In 2022, Robinhood reorganized into a general manager structure. So the GMs took responsibility for the company's different business units. As part of the reorg, content designers were also allocated to different business units, but there weren't enough CDs to go around. I had just stepped in to lead content design for our crypto business, and I only had one content designer to take with me. So I hired a part-time contractor to fill the gaps. It was a temporary Band-Aid, but hiring more content designers full-time was just not on the business's to-do list. So I had to make some tough trade-offs on which projects would get fed and which projects would starve. So luckily it was time for quarterly planning, so we used this time to identify the highest priority projects for crypto. I met with each of the product area leads to figure out what kind of support they would need. Here's another pro tip. The amount of work can often be underestimated in product roadmaps, so it's super important to do this work together. With each of the leads, we mapped out the amount of work, and then we stack ranked the projects that were most important to them. So I asked some pretty tough questions. Which projects would have the biggest impact on the business? And frankly, which projects would fail without content design support? We used a Gantt chart to agree on the project's content design with staff. So we dedicated our full-time content designer to crypto's biggest priority. It was a mission-critical new product launch. We expected it to get a lot of immediate attention. It was too big, it could not fail. Other projects were handled by our contractor on an ad hoc basis. It just depended on how important they were. Everything else was below the line. So one critical thing we did was note that if we had X number of content designers, we'd be able to support Y more projects. Were teams disappointed that they wouldn't have content design support? Yes, some were, yeah. But they understood how we'd prioritized, and they definitely understood that we only had 1.5 content designers. So it was pretty hard to disagree. So here's how it played out. The team that worked with a dedicated content designer, super happy. They spoke up all the time in meetings about how they relied on this person as a strategic leader. Other teams kept asking if he could stretch his bandwidth to help. I said no. So the teams that got limited support from the contractor sometimes struggled. Contractor was great, but he was only part-time, so he just wasn't available to do much more than put out fires. Finally, the teams without any content design support grumbled the most. The product managers or the product designers who tried to do the work themselves weren't happy about spending their time that way, and frankly, the quality suffered. Customer communications were hard to read, product flows were hard to follow, deadlines got pushed. I would remind the teams that they could help me advocate for more headcount to get the support that they needed. So after a couple of quarters, more partners were agitating for content design support. It was pretty clear to the general manager of the crypto business how critical that need had become. So the starvation was a success. After 6 months, our GM approved funding to hire another full-time content designer. We're actually interviewing candidates as we speak. If you know anyone, great. The takeaway here is no pain, no gain, but with a twist. Sometimes other teams need to feel the pain for your team to gain. Okay, you still with me? Let's touch on one common challenge I think we're all familiar with, and I can talk through the practical principle I use to address it. Cross-functional partners don't understand how to work with content designers. So we probably hear this pain point expressed a number of ways. Content design comes in too late, or I wish product would do X, or marketing would do Y when we work together. So, final principle. Change infrastructure, not individuals. We all have things we wish were different about how our teams work together. I mean, how many of us have told our content designers to demonstrate how we expect to collaborate with others? We might say, find ways to show your value, or just set up a jam session with your designers. I know I've told people this many times. The thing is, it puts 100% of the responsibility on the individual to make a case for the ideal working model. It's definitely important to identify the ideal way that we want to work, but it's most important to figure out what infrastructure we're gonna set in place to ensure that we consistently operate this way. What do I mean by infrastructure? Tools, process. These are just the mechanisms we implement and require everyone to follow when they're working through projects. So I'm actually going through a perfect example of this right now. Our org is making some changes to how we do design reviews. We've been hearing from design teams for a while that it's just not always clear what kind of work should be reviewed, at what stage should it be reviewed, Who is involved? Who is the sign-off? In part, this is because the company has grown so fast that we just haven't had a chance to answer these questions for ourselves. But it's also partly because we haven't codified a design review process in a way that every team can see, agree upon, and know exactly how to show up. So lack of infrastructure creates a lot of thrash for individuals. The thrash probably feels pretty familiar to most of us here. Content designers come in when designs are mostly baked. We have to rip them up and start over. Content designers get asked to deliver final copy in 3 days. Our communication strategy isn't even set yet. Legal swoops in at the last minute with conflicting feedback. It's not clear who makes the call. It's a lot to ask individuals to solve thrash all by themselves. They'll probably burn out, or they might even leave. So ultimately, it's a responsibility of leadership to set up the right mechanisms within the organization so that teams can all be aligned on the direction and the decisions that they need to move forward at the right time. Everyone needs a shared mental model. This is about the design process, and they also need to understand why we do it the way we do. So to solve our thrash problem, we've brought together a working group of leaders from product, content design, product design, research, and engineering. Our conversations on these topics have been so eye-opening. We just realized there are a lot of areas where we just weren't on the same page about what work looks like and who we think the decision makers are. So over the weeks that we've been working on this, I think we've come up with a pretty good model of how we think teams should collaborate in a design process. Our job now is to think deeply about the mechanisms we put in place. So this new way of working just becomes standard and totally turnkey. If we don't figure this out, then people will just go back to working the way that they have before. So here are some of the things we've been doing. First thing we did, our product requirements documentations were all over the place. So we standardized them, and we made sure that they identified some key things that every team would need to know before they start working. What is the size of this project? Who are the decision makers? And what review milestones they would need to be thinking about as they put their schedule together. We also created a project sizing rubric. Not everyone has a shared mental model about how important or big their project is. How complex is it? Will it be seen by millions of people? Does the C-suite really care about it? So we created a small, medium, and large rubric for sizing projects. It just helps teams know who needs to see the work and how far up the leadership chain it should go. We also define those design milestones. Not everyone agreed on how designs get made. Does everyone agree on what a concept looks like? Are we agreed that we should sign off on like a user flow or a messaging strategy before we get into detailed execution? When is a design even considered final? We defined each milestone in the design process, but we also built Figma templates that make it easy for teams to prep for reviews at each milestone. They bring the right deliverables, and they can set up the right questions that they need to answer. Finally, scheduling. No one really understood how to book one of these reviews. So we created a booking calendar in Coda. Everyone shares it. Anyone can sign up for a review, and the calendar alerts all the reviewers and the teammates so that people actually have enough time to prepare for the review. Finally, this is a work in progress. We regularly check in as a working group. We have to continually evaluate, is this process that we set up actually working? And what do we need to tweak to make it run smoother? While we'll definitely learn as we go, Just putting these mechanisms into place will make it easier for teams to adopt the new process. And look, this will help us see if it works to reduce thrash. If it doesn't, we will try something else. But to sum it up, individuals can identify problems and teams can even agree that change is needed. But it is super important to put the right infrastructure in place to make sure that the change is ultimately successful within the organization. So that's it. 3 practical principles for working your org. I hope at least some of these resonate with you. I hope you find them useful in navigating complicated situations in your workplaces. I hope you can use these to set content design up for success, even when it's not totally understood, which ultimately helps you as leaders have a bigger impact at your company. It's a win-win. Thanks, y'all.